So as we have seen, each dot then will execute one after the another. So result of previous dot then is passed to the next dot then. But if you have something that is dependent on the previous result, then you can't depend on this. So there is no guarantee that each previous dot then will execute after each dot then. They are executed by default. But if you have some asynchronous code, so let's say instead of here I am returning, here I have some code set timeout. Let's say after, so this code is promises for 3 seconds, so I want to execute this for 5 seconds. So let's say after 5 seconds I want to execute some code. This is after 5 seconds. So let's say there is some asynchronous code or you are making API call. So if you are getting API data, profile data from here, and your next code is dependent on that profile ID. So just like this particular post ID. So just like this particular, first you get post, you have that post data, and then you take that data dot post id, and depending on that you get the commit. Similarly, if you have something which is dependent on the previous result, then and that API is taking time, then there is no guarantee that each dot then previous dot then will be executed and then next dot then will be executed. So if you see here, I have data 3 here printed, and then you have data 4. Before that, after 5 seconds I am executing this is after dot then. So after 3 seconds you see data 1, 3 seconds later data 2, data 4. You can see that console.log is not printed yet, and after that you see that particular console.log. So there is no guarantee. If you write some API call here, if you write some API call and that API call result you are using in the next code, then there is no guarantee that you will always get that result, because that API call might take some time. So to avoid this issue, what you can do is you can return a promise. So instead of returning result.1, so here what you can do is, instead of returning this, I will comment this out, will cut this out, and here I will return new promise. Make sure you are returning, then only you can attach dot then. So resolve reject, and inside this, after 5 seconds you call that resolve, and here you can send the same data which we got. What I'm doing inside this, let me comment this out so it will not wait for a long time. So we have 2 8. Now after dot then, after now after this code, this will execute data 3, and here I am returning a promise. So next dot then will never execute until your previous code is executed. So until promise is resolved or reject, your not dot then attached dot then will never execute. So what is happening after 5 seconds? So you will see data 3, then after 5 seconds you will see this message, then you are resolving reject, then you get that particular data 4. So if I refresh here, you will see data 1 printed, then data 3 is printed, and after that you will see that 5 seconds later you will see console.log, you can see, and then you see that data 4. So if you have something which is dependent on the previous code, then you should return a promise from the previous dot then. Only then the next dot then will execute. Otherwise it will execute immediately. If I don't return promise here and just call this set timeout, there is no guarantee. Like this code will execute first, and after 5 seconds this code will execute. So we don't want that. So in that case you return a promise. So until you call resolve, your next dot then will never execute. So what I am doing, I am printing data 3. After 5 seconds I am printing this log, but I am not calling resolve now. So what will happen, your next dot then will never execute because your API call is successful, but you are not sending back the data. So until, as I said, until you call resolve or reject, your promise will never fulfill. And until it's not fulfilled, your attached dot then will never execute. So even we are not calling reject, so our catch will also never execute. So you will just see data 3, and after that you will not see anything. So if I save this, you can see 3 seconds later data 1, after 3 seconds data 3, and after that you see this message, and after that you don't see anything. So your application is not pausing. So when you don't call resolve, that does not mean your application has stopped. It will continue to execute your next code. So if you have some code here, set timeout, let's say after 6 seconds, after let's say 10 seconds, I want to execute this after 10 seconds. So this is the code that will execute after 10 seconds. So here we are waiting for 5 seconds. So if I save this, let me minimize this. So after this, if I refresh, so you will see data 1, then you see data 3, then you will see that console.log statement, and then we are not resolving. So you can see, you immediately see after 10 seconds, and then this is after 5 seconds. You don't resolve, it does not mean your application will stop and it will go infinite loop. It just means that whatever callback handler you have attached for that particular promise, that will not execute, but your program will continue to execute as you have written. So this is very important. So if your previous next code is dependent on the previous result, previous API result, then you should return a promise from the previous and resolve that. Then only your next dot, then you will get correct data which is coming from the API. So no matter how much time it takes for the API to get that data, this code, this console.log will always execute after you have that data. That is a guarantee, because you are using promise. The promise will wait until you call or resolve or reject, and only when you call resolve, your dot then will execute. If you call reject, your catch will execute. So that is a very important thing you need to understand. So even though you attach dot then, multiple dot then, by default it executes one after the another. If you have some asynchronous code in any of the dot, then your next dot then might execute before. So there is no guarantee. So that is all about, that is very important to understand. Now if you see, we are creating a promise here. There is another way. So let's say function resolve promise function, and from this I will return a promise. We'll have resolve, reject. We normally, what we do, we call resolve or reject. So I can say resolve. Now to get the result of this, I can call this resolve promise, and as this function is returning promise, I need to attach dot then to get the actual data, and I can just log this to the console. So I'm using implicit return syntax of arrow function. So you don't have to always open curly bracket and print that. If you have single statement, you can print on the same line. And always make sure to attach catch. So if there is any error, your catch will execute and your program will not stop. It will just log. So now after this, so you can see immediately after this line of code, you see result. Even though I am calling it immediately, I am not waiting for something. You can see resolve promise, I am calling and immediately I am resolving. Still you see this code, this line of code is executed before. So I have this line of code here, and it executed this promise is resolved later. Why? Because promises are always resolved later. So if you have some console normal synchronous code, that will execute first, and then your promise related code will be executed. So that's why you always see other code first, console.log, and then you see result. So you immediately get a result. So this is the old way. If you have want to resolve it quickly, what you can do, you return promise. There is another way, like promise dot resolve, and you can just say resolve. Now you can see you immediately get this result. So code and this code are exactly same. So you don't have to create a function then accept, resolve, reject. If you want to immediately resolve or reject, you can directly use promise.resolve. And you can also use promise.reject. So both works. So I can say rejected. You can see, you see this rejected. So this is a shorter way of doing the same thing. So usually we don't write this part of code, so that is written by someone else. We just use those that code to consume the data. So let's say usually what we do is we use fetch. So if you want to make some API call, so let's say JSON placeholder, I will make API call to this. Let's say I want to get list of posts. So I will call this. So this is what is fetch. Fetch and Axios, if you are using, they are promise based API. So if I use search for Axios, you can see promise based HTTP client. So fetch and Axios are promise based API. So the promise code which we have written here, this code is implemented by that particular library. We just attach dot then and dot catch to get that data. So this fetch API will be just like our sum function, which accepts some parameters and do some code calculation and then resolve that. So what it does, fetch accepts a URL. So this will function will accept a URL and it will make the API call. And when that API result comes, it calls that resolve function and pass that data. So when we call resolve, and return a promise, we can attach dot then. So usually you will see code like this. So fetch is actual implementation of promises, and then we attach dot then to get the actual data, because fetch returns a promise. So only if some function is returning promise, then only we can attach dot then. That you need to remember. So now fetch, there is some difference with fetch and Axios. So fetch does not get the data immediately. So you have to first call this attach dot then, and whatever result comes, let me log it to the console so you will see it. Comment out all other code. So you can see this is the data returned by the fetch. So it contains header, status, and all other information, but it does not contain our actual data coming from that API. So to get that actual data, what you need to do is so let me log this, and we need to return result.json. So it's normally you will see response instead of result. You can call it anything. So what I am doing is I am returning response.json. So when you return something from dot then, you can attach next dot then, and that result whatever you are returning will be sent automatically to next dot then. Now I can print the result, and this will print the actual data coming from that API. You can see this is the actual data that we get. So this is the response that we want. So with fetch you have to attach two dot then. So first dot then you need to call response.json. So if you have single line, you can directly implicitly return that. So the dot then response.json, so it will automatically send to next dot then, and here you will get data. And you also need to attach catch, don't forget that. So if something goes wrong, your application will not stop. So this is how we use promises. So we don't write this promise code ourselves. Rarely we write that, but that is also important to know. So the fetch function actually writes this code of promises, and it just returns a promise. So whenever any function returns a promise, we can attach dot then. So we get that data. So if you are using Axios, you don't have to write this lot of code. So let's say I am using Axios CDN. So just by including this library, we can directly use Axios. So now I will add this Axios library. So make sure to add it before the promises. So it's added in before promises. Now I can use Axios. So if I just log Axios, you will see it correctly prints the function. So that means Axios is available. Now we will write the same code using Axios. I will copy this Axios.get, use this, and now this also returns a promise, so we can attach dot then, and you will immediately get result. You can see you get that result, and it contains a data property. So headers and all these information status is inside the first response itself. So you don't have to again call .json, just like this fetch function. So you can just print data result.data. So data contains the actual all the data response of that API. So result contains everything, header, status, everything, and it has a data property which contains the actual data. So when you are using Axios, you always get the actual data in the data property result.data, and you also attach .catch here and attach .catch. This is the way you can use the promises and get that data. This is the code that we write normally to work with the promises. So Axios and Fetch are promise based API. To use Axios, you need to use CDN or install the library. For Fetch, Fetch is inbuilt into JavaScript, so you don't have to use anything. You don't have to install anything. You can directly use Fetch.